It was a late afternoon in early March when the city's air carried the strange mix of exhaust fumes, rain-soaked asphalt, and the faint aroma of fried food from a nearby market. The streets were restless with the noise of car horns, the shuffle of hurried feet, and vendors shouting over one another for attention. In the middle of this chaos, leaning against the crumbling wall of an abandoned shop, sat a man with a paper cup in his hands. His clothes were worn thin, the color faded beyond recognition, and his eyes, dark, tired, and sunken, scanned faces without much hope. He didn't ask loudly for money. He didn't reach out or block anyone's path. Instead, he had a quiet sign beside him, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Do you also cry from hunger?" No one stopped to read it for long. Most pretended not to notice. A few glanced, guilt flickering in their expressions before they looked away. He would lift his head every time someone slowed down near him, but most of those moments ended with nothing but the sound of coins clinking in someone else's pocket as they walked past. The man's name, though strangers rarely asked, was Samuel. His skin, once smooth and warm in tone, was now dry and cracked from years of sleeping, where the cold never cared who you were. He used to have a home, a job, and a small family. But if you asked him what happened, his answers came slowly, like pulling threads from a tightly knotted cloth. On the other side of the city, behind the high gates of a sprawling white mansion, the world felt like it existed in another reality. Marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and every corner smelled faintly of imported flowers. The owner of this house, though rarely seen outside his tinted window cars, was a man everyone in business circles knew: Daniel Harper. He was the type of man who could silence a room just by stepping inside. Tall, sharp-featured, always in a tailored suit, he carried an air that told you he was used to being obeyed. His life had been built on numbers, deals, and a ruthless belief that success belonged to those willing to crush anyone standing in the way. Yet, to the public, Daniel was also a generous man, sponsoring charity galas and donating to causes that kept his name glowing in newspapers. These two men, Samuel and Daniel, lived in the same city, but belonged to entirely different worlds. One fought each day to find his next meal. The other woke up to breakfast trays so lavish they could feed a family for a week. Yet fate was quietly tying their paths together, though neither of them could see it yet. Before the tragedy, Samuel's days were simple in a cruel way. He would rise before sunrise, his back aching from sleeping on the concrete, and walk the same streets in search of places where people might feel generous enough to toss him a few coins. Sometimes, he sat outside the bakery on 7th Street, hoping the smell of bread would soften someone's heart. Other times, he stayed near the bus stop, where tired workers might see him as they ended their day. His hunger was constant, but worse was the silence, the way people looked through him, as if he didn't exist. Daniel's mornings, on the other hand, began with a team of staff moving quietly through the mansion, preparing everything to his liking. He had a wife, Margaret, who wore diamonds casually and seemed to float from charity meetings to social events without ever touching the ground. They had one son, Michael, a boy with dark hair and a quiet smile. Michael was different from his parents. He noticed things they didn't, like the man who sat outside the bakery or the boy selling flowers on the roadside. Daniel loved his son, but in his own way, with expensive gifts, not with time or gentle words. There were tensions behind the mansion's perfect walls. Margaret's polite smiles in public masked arguments in private. Daniel's temper, always just beneath the surface, could turn cold in an instant. Money was never the problem. It was control. Every decision in that house had to pass through him, every plan approved, every opinion measured against his. People outside thought they were a perfect family. People inside knew better. Somewhere in the spaces between Samuel's hunger and Daniel's pride, the first threads of what was coming began to form. It started small, an overheard conversation, a chance encounter, an unasked question left hanging in the air. But those moments would grow sharper, pulling both men toward a point they could neither see nor avoid. And when that point came, it would shatter not just their lives, but everything they thought they understood about loss, justice, and the price of survival. The city that day seemed normal. Buses running late, rain puddles reflecting neon lights, strangers brushing shoulders without looking up. Yet, beneath the surface, something fragile was trembling, as if the ground itself knew the peace was borrowed and the debt was about to be collected. Samuel first noticed the boy in early spring, when the days were still cold enough to make your breath visible. Michael had been sitting in the back seat of a sleek black car, the kind Samuel never expected to see parked near the market. The driver had stepped out to buy something from the bakery, and that's when the boy's eyes met his. It wasn't a long stare, more like an accidental moment, but Samuel could tell the boy had seen him, not the way others glanced and moved on, but with the kind of look that carried quiet questions. The car pulled away before anything else could happen, yet the moment stuck with him. In the Harper mansion, Daniel's life was entering a more volatile phase. Business deals that had always worked in his favor were starting to slip from his control. A major contract overseas had been lost to a rival, and whispers in the financial community suggested his empire wasn't as untouchable as it seemed. These losses didn't make him poor, not even close, but they lit a fuse beneath his already short temper. Margaret began to tread more carefully around him, her voice quieter at the dinner table, her plans for upcoming charity events suddenly needing his approval in a way they hadn't before. Michael, now 14, was caught in the middle of a household that seemed polished on the outside but brittle inside. His father's moods were unpredictable. Sometimes Daniel spoke to him with pride, sharing big dreams about the family legacy. Other times he dismissed Michael entirely, making him feel like a guest in his own home. The boy began taking walks in the city without telling his parents, just to escape the heavy air of the mansion. That was when he saw Samuel again, this time sitting outside the bus station, his paper cup beside him and the same sign leaning against his knee. Their second meeting wasn't much more than a few words. Michael had handed him a seikigi cheese sandwich wrapped in wax paper, bought from a vendor down the street. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly, the words carrying a weight Michael didn't fully understand yet. The boy didn't stay long, afraid his driver would notice he'd wandered too far. But over the next weeks, Michael found reasons to pass that same corner, and Samuel began to expect him. The talks grew a little longer each time, still cautious, as if both were feeling their way into a connection they couldn't name. Back in Daniel's world, the pressure mounted. A former business partner, once one of his closest allies, had started leaking rumors about questionable deals. Daniel denied everything, but the fear of scandal kept him awake at night. His charity appearances increased, his donations became louder, all to drown out whispers he couldn't control. Margaret noticed his drinking in the evenings had become heavier. He didn't yell often, but when he did, it was sharp enough to cut through the house. Michael's secret meetings with Samuel might have stayed harmless, if not for the overheard conversation one rainy afternoon. Daniel's driver, sent to find Michael, had followed him down the street and caught sight of him handing Samuel a thermos of hot tea. The driver didn't say anything then, but later in the kitchen, Margaret heard him mention "that homeless man your boy's been talking to," in a low voice to the head maid. The words travelled through the house faster than any secret could stay hidden. By dinner, Daniel knew the argument that followed wasn't just about Samuel. It was about control. Daniel demanded to know why Michael was wasting his time and risking his safety in such places. Michael, usually quiet, pushed back for the first time. He told his father that Samuel wasn't dangerous, that he was just a man who needed help. Daniel's face hardened in a way Michael had never seen before. The conversation ended with Daniel forbidding him to ever go near that part of the city again. But forbidding something to a 14-year-old boy only made it more certain he would do it again. Michael began sneaking out more often, careful to avoid the driver's usual routes. Samuel started opening up about his past in pieces, A job lost after an injury, a son he hadn't seen in years. The way everything had unraveled so fast, he couldn't stop it. Michael listened, storing each detail like puzzle pieces he wanted to fit together. What neither of them knew was that someone else had started watching. A thin man in a frayed leather jacket had been lingering near the bus station lately. Samuel recognized him instantly from years ago. Eli, an old drinking companion from the days when Samuel still had a roof over his head. Eli was bad news, always looking for an angle, and Samuel didn't like the way he was now watching Michael. One afternoon, Eli cornered Samuel in the alley behind the station and started asking questions about the boy's family. Samuel told him nothing, but the look in Eli's eyes made it clear he already suspected the truth. Meanwhile, Margaret, caught between husband and son, tried to keep the peace in the house, but failed to see the danger growing outside it. Her focus was on smoothing Daniel's temper, attending more events, and maintaining the family's image. She didn't notice how restless Michael had become, or how drawn he was to a world far outside their gates. Tensions inside the Harper household reached a peak when Daniel's business troubles became public. A major newspaper ran a story questioning the ethics of some of his deals. Though nothing was proven, the damage to his pride was deep. He became more controlling with Michael, more suspicious of Margaret's activities, and more determined to keep every part of his life under his own grip. But cracks had already formed in the walls he'd built, and through those cracks, danger was slipping in. It was a small thing, almost forgettable at the time, that tipped the balance. Michael had left a folded note in his jacket pocket, a scrap of paper with Samuel's name, and the words, "Bus station, 4 p.m., written in his own handwriting. Daniel found it while looking for his car keys one morning. He didn't confront Michael right away, but his mind began spinning with questions. Why was this man important enough for his son to write down? What had he been told? And most troubling, what did this stranger know about the Harper family? The following days were tense in ways no one could fully name. Samuel, sensing Eli's growing interest in Michael, thought about telling the boy to stop coming. But loneliness made him hesitate, and the truth was, Michael's visits were the only moments in his day that still felt human. It was during this fragile, dangerous balance, trust beginning to fray, outside eyes watching, and Daniel's anger simmering, that the events began sliding towards something no one could stop. It was a Thursday evening when the storm rolled in, heavy clouds swallowing what was left of the daylight. The streets shimmered with rain, and the bus station's flickering yellow lights cast long shadows that swayed in the wind. Samuel sat on his usual spot against the wall, the paper cup beside him, catching stray drops from the leaky roof above. He was waiting for Michael. The boy had been late before, but tonight something felt different. An itch between Samuel's shoulder blades, a pressure in the air that wasn't just the weather. Michael was late because of an argument. Daniel had intercepted him in the hallway, waving the crumpled note he'd found days earlier. His voice was low but sharp, demanding an explanation. Michael tried to lie, saying Samuel was just someone he'd seen once or twice. But Daniel's eyes, dark and burning, told him he didn't believe a word. The argument rose until Margaret stepped in, telling both of them to stop. But Michael had already grabbed his jacket and stormed out into the rain. Daniel didn't follow. He simply stood in the doorway, jaw tight, as if measuring what would happen next. By the time Michael reached the station, his sneakers were soaked and his hair plastered to his forehead. Samuel gave him a small nod, relief softening the lines of his face. But before they could say more than a few words, a figure moved out from the shadows near the alley. Eli. He walked toward them with that slow, unblinking confidence of someone who knew he had the upper hand. "You've been keeping interesting company, Sam," Eli said, his voice just loud enough to carry over the rain. "Rich company." Samuel stood quickly, placing himself slightly in front of Michael. "Go home, Eli," he said, his tone steady but strained. Eli smiled, but there was no humor in it. No, I think this is my lucky day. Kid, your daddy wouldn't want anything bad happening to you, would he? He might even pay to make sure it doesn't. Michael's face went pale. He stepped back, but Eli closed the gap fast, grabbing his arm. Samuel lunged forward, shoving Eli hard, and the three of them stumbled into the narrow alley. The sounds of the rain hitting the dumpsters and metal siding made the space feel even smaller, the air tight with tension. The fight was clumsy but violent. Samuel tried to pull Eli away from Michael, but Eli's fist caught him across the jaw. Michael struggled free, only for Eli to grab him again by the hood of his jacket. "You think you're better than me? That your daddy's money keeps you safe?" Eli snarled. Something in Samuel snapped then, a sudden white-hot burst of fear and fury. He grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground, swinging it without thinking. The hollow clang as it connected with Eli's head was deafening. Eli's eyes widened in shock before his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the wet pavement. For a few seconds, no one moved. The rain kept falling, washing thin streams of blood toward the gutter. Samuel's chest heaved, the pipe still clenched in his shaking hands. Michael stared, frozen, his breath coming in short bursts. "Is he?" Michael's voice was barely a whisper. Samuel didn't answer right away. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers to Eli's neck, but the truth was clear before he even touched him. The man wasn't breathing. Samuel's thoughts started to race. Images of police, prison cells, the life he'd barely been surviving now completely gone. He dropped the pipe, the clang echoing against the brick walls. Michael stumbled back, his mind spinning. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had wanted to help Samuel, not watch him kill someone. But there was no time to think about what it meant. They both knew they couldn't stay there. "Go," Samuel said, his voice rough. "Go home. Now." Michael shook his head, still rooted to the spot. "I can't just leave." "Yes, you can. And you will," Samuel cut in, his tone sharper than Michael had ever heard. "If you're here when someone finds him, your life is over. Do you understand me?" Michael hesitated, torn between loyalty and fear, before finally turning and running. His footsteps splashed through the puddles, fading into the night. Samuel stood alone in the alley, the sound of the rain now deafening. He didn't know how long he stood there staring at Eli's still body before the reality of what he'd done settled into his bones. He thought of his son, how he'd failed him, how he'd lost him, and now, in a twisted way, he'd failed Michael too. When Samuel finally moved, it wasn't toward the police. He dragged Eli's body toward the deeper shadows of the alley, his hands slipping in the wet. His mind was a blur, caught between instinct and dread. He didn't know if he was hiding the body or just delaying the inevitable. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Michael burst through the doors, dripping water onto the marble floor. Margaret rushed toward him, asking what had happened, but he brushed past her, heading straight for his room. Daniel, sitting in the study with a drink in hand, didn't say a word. He simply watched his son's pale face disappear up the stairs, the storm outside still raging. Neither Samuel nor Michael knew it yet, but the night's events had already begun to ripple outward, setting in motion a chain of consequences they could never escape. By morning, the rain had washed the streets clean, but the city felt heavier. News spread quickly in certain corners. A man found dead in an alley behind the bus station. No witnesses, no suspects. The police presence was immediate. Yellow tape stretched across the narrow lane, uniformed officers keeping bystanders at bay while detectives combed the ground for anything useful. Word traveled among the homeless first, whispers moving from bench to bench. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was murder. Samuel didn't go near the station. He'd left the city before dawn, walking for hours with no clear destination. Every step felt slower, his legs carrying not just his body but the weight of what he had done. He replayed the moment over and over, the sound and of the pipe connecting, the shock in Eli's eyes, the way his body crumpled. He told himself he had no choice, that it was Eli or Michael. But the justification felt thin, dissolving under the memory of Eli's blood mixing with the rainwater. At the Harper mansion, Michael stayed in his room with the door locked. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since coming home the night before. Margaret checked on him, but he insisted he was just tired. Daniel, however, noticed the way Michael's hands shook when he picked up a glass at breakfast, the way his eyes avoided everyone's. He didn't ask about it, not yet. Daniel was a man who believed in waiting for the right moment, and his silence was more unsettling than any confrontation. By the third day, the murder had made the evening news. Eli wasn't a man the public knew, but the crime was described as brutal and senseless. Reporters mentioned his history, petty thefts, drug charges, vagrancy, but the focus was on the fact that he had been killed. Michael froze when the report played on TV. He wanted to turn away, but the sound of the reporter's voice held him still. It was strange hearing Eli described in neat sentences. Stripped of the menace Michael had felt in that alley, Samuel had found shelter in an abandoned building on the edge of the industrial district. He stayed there, hidden from the rain and from the people who might recognize him. At night, sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the echo of Eli's voice and the image of Michael's pale face in the flickering light. Guilt gnawed at him, but so did fear. He'd been on the streets long enough to know how the police worked. If they found him, they wouldn't care about his reasons. Margaret noticed changes in Dardanelle too. He was quieter, more watchful. One evening, she found him standing in the hallway outside Michael's door, listening. She asked what he was doing, but he brushed her off, claiming he was just checking on him. Something in his tone told her not to press. The community's reaction was mixed. Some people saw Eli as another casualty of the streets, a man whose life had been spiraling long before it ended. Others were angry, another life taken without justice. Police statements promised they were following several leads, but there was no arrest, no suspect named. For many, it was just another headline to forget by next week. For Michael, forgetting wasn't possible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment Samuel swung the pipe. He told himself Samuel had saved him, that Eli would have hurt him if nothing had been done. But the image was fixed in his mind, untouchable by excuses. He began avoiding his friends, skipping activities he once enjoyed, and spending long hours staring out his window at the city beyond the gates. Daniel, putting the pieces together in his way, began to suspect more than he let on. He knew Michael had been meeting Samuel. He knew something had happened that night. And he knew, just from the boy's silence, that Michael would never willingly tell him the full truth. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to let uncertainty go unanswered. For Samuel, too, days blurred into one another. He scavenged food where he could, staying away from crowded areas. Every distant siren made his stomach twist. He thought about turning himself in, about explaining what happened. But the thought of prison, the cold walls, the loss of what little freedom he had, kept him frozen. The guilt didn't fade. It settled deeper, becoming part of his bones. The murder became less of a story in the news by the second week, replaced by fresher tragedies. But for those connected to it, the silence after the headlines was louder than the coverage itself. Michael carried the memory in his chest like a locked box, while Samuel carried it in his every step, a shadow that followed no matter how far he walked. And yet, beneath all that guilt and fear, there was something else neither of them could quite name, a thread of connection forged in the darkest moment, binding them together in a way that could never be undone. Months passed before the truth surfaced, but when it did, it didn't come in the dramatic way people might imagine. There was no sudden police raid, no tense standoff in a crowded street. It began with a tip, a nameless voice on the other end of a phone telling detectives to look for the man who sits outside the bakery on 7th Street. By then, Samuel had stopped going there, but the name and the description were enough. Officers began asking quiet questions in the neighborhoods where he used to sleep. Eventually, they found him in an abandoned warehouse, thin, exhausted, and too tired to run. At the station, Samuel didn't fight the accusation. He told them about Eli, about Michael, and about the moment that changed everything. The detectives listened, but the facts didn't erase the reality. Eli was dead, and Samuel had swung the pipe. His claim of self-defense wasn't dismissed outright, but the law weighed more heavily on actions than intentions. In the end, the court sentenced him to a reduced term, years behind bars instead of decades, recognizing that the killing had not been planned, but still punishing the act. Michael was never called to testify publicly. Daniel's influence, and perhaps his money, ensured that. Still, the boy lived with the quiet knowledge of what had happened and what had been hidden from H. His relationship with his father changed in ways that could never be undone. Daniel had always been a man of control, but now Michael saw him as something else too, a man who could bend the truth to protect what was his, even if it meant twisting justice. Margaret's role in it all was quieter, but no less significant. She carried her form of guilt, not for the crime itself, but for the distance she had let grow between herself and her son. In the months that followed, she tried to close that gap, but Michael, though polite, kept part of himself locked away. He smiled less, spoke less, and carried an air of watchfulness unusual for someone his age. The community reacted in predictable ways. Some saw Samuel as a violent man who had taken a life and deserved to be punished. Others viewed him as a victim of circumstance, a man pushed to the edge by poverty, desperation, and the dangers of life on the streets. Eli, in death, became another reminder of how invisible people are until something terrible happens. But the discussion faded quickly, as it always does, replaced by newer stories. What lingered were the questions that no verdict could answer. Was justice served when the law punished a man for protecting a boy from harm? Was it justice when influence kept that boy's name far from the investigation? Was it justice when Eli's life was reduced to a few lines in a court file, his past mistakes overshadowing the fact that he was human? In the privacy of his cell, Samuel thought often of Michael. He didn't regret protecting him, but he wondered if he had also robbed him of something. Maybe innocence, maybe trust. For Michael, the memory of that night became a turning point, the line between the world as he had known it and the world as it truly was. He learned that safety wasn't guaranteed, that good and bad weren't always clear, and that people could be both protector and destroyer in the same breath. Daniel continued his life much as before, meetings, deals, charity dinners, but there was a slight shift in him too. He had always understood the power of money, but now he had seen intimately how it could rewrite reality, whether he felt pride or shame, for that was something he kept to himself. In the end, the story left no one untouched. It highlighted the fragility of the line between survival and crime, the way desperation could turn an ordinary moment into something irreversible. It showed how the wealthy could shield themselves from the full weight of consequences, while the poor were left to bear them in full. And it revealed in the quietest ways the complexity of human behavior, the fact that people can be driven by fear, love, anger, and desperation all at once. Justice, in its purest form, might be an ideal, but in reality, it was tangled in power, perception, and circumstance. Samuel paid with years of his life. Michael paid with a wound that wouldn't heal. Daniel paid nothing tangible, but perhaps something deeper that only he could measure. And somewhere, beyond the reach of headlines and courtrooms, life in the city went on. Buses still ran late, rain still fell on empty streets, and strangers still passed each other without looking up, unaware of the stories unfolding quietly around them.